I'm going to demonstrate how to make short crust pastry. So I've started off, I've got 200 grams of plain flour and I'm just adding in a pinch of salt, and the salt is just going to give some flavour to it. I'm going to use a combination of butter and white fat. So this is just Trex. It's an alternative to lard, which is an animal fat. So this is lower in saturated fat, and obviously our butter is there because it is going to give a flavour and colour, but the white fat is there because it will make it a bit more crumbly and shortens better. So it's got better properties for shortening. So to start with, I'm just going to use my knife and I'm just going to cut it into small bits into the flour. So we're using plain flour because it's got a low gluten content. So we don't want chewy pastry. We want a nice, soft, crumbly pastry. Obviously, self-raising flour has raising agent in it, so we don't use that. So we're using plain flour as opposed to strong flour or bread flour. And we're just cutting in our fat into our flour because this is the process of shortening. So shortening is where we rub in our fat to our flour. And what happens is the fat gives each of the starch grains a nice waterproof protective coating, so that actually it prevents it from absorbing too much liquid and creating gluten. So when we actually finish off with our pastry, we end up with a crumbly texture because it's got lots of shorter fibres into it rather than long structures of gluten, which we would have in bread. So we're just using our fingertips and you are just rubbing the fat into the flour. Short crust pastry, the ratio is half the amount of fat to flour. So if you needed to make more or less pastry, you could increase the amount of flour and use half the amount of fat to it. So you can see that I'm moving it around and I'm getting to the bottom of the bowl as well to make sure that we're getting all of that flour, and you're getting a more crumbly breadcrumb-like texture. It's looking a bit sandy. Once you get to the stage where you feel that you've got big chunks that you can't necessarily get rid of, just rub it between your two hands so that it's nice and light and crumbly. If you just give your bowl a shake and a bit of a tap, any big lumps will come to the top. Okay, once you're satisfied that it's all rubbed in, you are going to add your water to your mixture. And for 200 grams of flour, I am going to add 8 teaspoons of water. So it's 1 teaspoon for every 25 grams. Now, I'm using cold water because we need to keep our ingredients as cold as possible. Okay, and the reason why we need to keep our ingredients as cold as possible is so that the fat doesn't melt, because if it starts to melt it will make it greasy, which is why we only use our fingertips. If you do feel that you have got hot hands, run your wrists underneath the cold water tap and that should cool down your hands a little bit. If you still struggle with the fact that you've got hot hands and you just end up with greasy pastry, use a food processor. Okay, so bring it together and you can see that it's actually coming together into clumps. It isn't going to stick together at this point. What you need to do is you need to squeeze it together into a ball, and that should all leave you with a clean bowl. You don't want to handle it too much because, again, we don't want to get that greasy pastry. We're not developing the gluten. We don't want to knead it. We just want to bring it together. And now, before we roll it out, we are just going to allow it to rest for about 10 to 15 minutes. So you should have a ball of pastry that comes together. Once your pastry's rested for about 15-20 minutes and it's been in a cool place, you're going to roll out your pastry. I just wipe down my side with a damp cloth and then dust the area that I'm going to roll out my pastry on with some plain flour. That's so that it actually sticks to the worktop rather than to your pastry, because if you add more flour to your pastry, it's going to dry it out. Okay, so you've got your ball of pastry and I've got my rolling pin. And what I'm just going to do is I am going to line a baking dish, so I want it round. And to start off with, I'm just going to mould it. And I'm going to use my hand to push it down and round, and then the other one to push it out. If I started rolling it out straight away, the pastry would crack. You can see that there are some cracks that are forming within my pastry, so we just need to kind of keep it together and work with it, otherwise we'll have to keep on re-rolling it and bringing it together. So just dust your rolling pin with a small amount of flour, and then the rule for short crust pastry is one roll and then a 90-degree turn. Now you can see how that is starting to crumble a little bit, so just using your hand, pushing it in, making a curve with this hand and down and out with the other hand, and that will bring those cracks back together. You need to roll it and turn it each time, because otherwise it will start to stick to your worktop and it makes it an awful lot more difficult to pick up. So just doing one roll, turn, and hopefully we should end up with a nice pastry round. We're looking to get it so that it's about the thickness of a pound coin. So keep on rolling it, just being careful because it will be delicate, it will break. If you feel that you need a bit of extra flour on your worktop, just dust a little bit more down and put your pastry back over. And in terms of the size, so we're looking at about the thickness of a pound coin, but obviously you need to have it so it will cover the base and it will go up the sides of your dish. So we just need to try and get that a little bit rounder. And bring those cracks together. So it's just being careful, it's just watching where you're at with your pastry. But that should now be big enough to actually line my tin. So to line my tin, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my rolling pin to pick up my pastry. Just a little bit thinner there. If you have got rolling guides at home, that will give you an even thickness of pastry when you're rolling it. So just pick it up around your rolling pin, move your dish that you're going to line onto the side, and with this I'm going to do something that's called blind baking. Okay, so I'm going to bake it without anything in it, so we're baking our pastry shell. We're not just going to push it in, you're going to lift up the sides to get it into the corners, lift up the sides and gently push it down to the bottom of your tin. Okay, if you push it down without lifting it up, you will just cut the sides of it and you'll end up with more of a plate rather than a dish. Okay, and if you're making a pie or if you're making a quiche, that then obviously reduces the capacity and it's more likely to break in the corner. Now you can see that there are a couple of cracks, but that's fine for now. So once we've got it so that it's down into the corners, the dish that I've got is quite a good one because it means I can just roll over the top like that and it cuts the edge off for you. Okay, if you haven't got a dish which you can just use the rolling pin to cut, you can just get your knife and you can trim it off going around like that. Now I'll do it on this bit here. So if you've not got a dish, you can just trim off with a knife so that you're doing it on an angle, trying to get it so it does overhang a little bit. And then if you have got a fluted dish, maybe just go around and lift up the bits that have been squashed so that you get a nice deep dish. Okay, and just neaten it off. so it's all an even size. In terms of these bits where there's cracks, you can just use some of your leftover pastry and you can just fill in those cracks, because if you are making a quiche, for example, you are going to blind bake your pastry and then you're going to add a liquid filling into that. And if you add a liquid filling into your pie dish and there are cracks in your pastry, the liquid will seep through and it will give your pastry a soggy bottom. Once you've lined your tin, we're ready to blind bake it. So blind baking it, as I said, is baking it without anything in it. We're just baking the pastry case. But if we put it in the oven like that, the base is going to rise, it will puff up. So we need to have something to hold it down. So I've just got some grease-free paper that I've just squished up into a ball. And I am then just going to place that into my pastry case. And on top of that, you could either decide that you were going to use some baking beans if you've got them, the ceramic baking beans. I sometimes find that they're a bit too heavy. Or if you've not got any baking beans, some dried rice or some dried lentils works perfectly. So you can just keep a container of them that you use for blind baking pastry. So as soon as you finish with them, you put them back into your container and you can use them again next time that you are going to do some blind baking. So when your pastry case is ready, that's then going to go into the oven on gas mark 6 or 200 degrees Celsius for about 10 to 15 minutes until the pastry base is cooked all of the way through. So I've had my pastry in for about 12 minutes, just being careful to not drop any of the lentils into the pastry, and just lifting that out and then removing a few bits of lentils. Now you can see that actually it's probably just going to need another couple of minutes. It's browning on the edges quite well, but the bottom maybe just needs that patch so that it's cooked through a little bit more. So I'm just going to return it to the oven without the baking beans for another couple of minutes. Once your pastry case is cooked, you're then ready to put some filling into it. For this, I'm going to do a quiche. So actually, I am just going to sprinkle some cheese over the bottom, just so that it's got that flavour going in there. And then I've just prepared some vegetables, and so that they don't release their liquid into the quiche, I've just fried them off slightly first. So you could look at arranging them into your pastry case so that they're spread out evenly. Tomatoes are cut, which you could use to actually help you with portion sizes. So it could always be that you're looking at a tomato per slice, and then just finish off with some extra cheese, which will just give it that flavour. Now the quiche mixture and the filling is a combination of milk and egg, and for this size dish I have just done 100 millilitres of milk with 1 egg, and as the egg cooks it will coagulate. So it's liquid at the moment, so just mixed it together. It's liquid at the moment, and I'm just going to pour it in. I always put the filling in first, because then you can work out how much space that you've actually got to fill with your liquid mixture. And you just want to take it just so that it's just underneath the top of your pastry case. You don't want to go over your pastry case, because as we said before, it will leak out and it will stick to the bottom of your pastry and make it more difficult in getting it out. Okay, so that was just about the right amount for this. You can season it, you can add herbs into it, you can look at adding chicken or ham or fish into your pastry case for your quiche. And then at that point, that is going to go into the oven to bake for about 25 to 30 minutes on gas mark 6, 200 degrees C. And you're getting it so that at the moment, it's liquid. Okay, so you want to get it so it's just got a wobble and it's set. So the egg is going to coagulate, because it's going to go from that liquid to that solid, and it is going to cook your quiche. So your quiche is ready when it's got a nice golden colour over the top and it is got a wobble, as opposed to having a liquidy bit in the centre.